Today I'd like to explore in a different direction, taking a look at Phantasialand. In the world of themed entertainment, Disney and Universal continue to dominate the cultural narrative, and obviously I've had a lot to say about them. However, as a theme park fan, I would like to broaden the scope of the channel, exploring out beyond just these two mega giants and really taking a look at other parks that offer exceptional experiences. In July of 2021, I produced a video exploring the attractions and theming of Efteling, a park located in the Netherlands. It's still one of my favorite videos that I've ever produced because of how fantastic that park is, and it's definitely the top of my list for parks I want to visit outside of the United States. However, Phantasialand comes in at a close second, absolutely dripping with theming and full of attractions that look exceptional and should be enticing for anyone who's a fan of theme parks. Who builds not one, but two exceptional roller coasters that weave in and out of entire themed cityscapes? Something I've noticed with the theming of European parks is that they often have a strong sense of charm that their American counterparts lack. They just simply seem to care more about the guest experience, and so that's how we get such fantastic and unique attractions. With that being said, Phantasialand absolutely raises the bar of what we as park goers should expect from a themed experience, and so I'm quite excited to really dive into the park's offerings. Phantasialand opened in 1967 and is located in Brühl, Germany. The park is incredibly small, only taking up about 69 acres. In comparison, Magic Kingdom takes up around 107, just to kind of give you a sense of scale. Because Phantasialand is so small, the park has frequently demolished old attractions and even entire lands in favor of building something new. Because of the large number of changes, chronicling the entire history of the park could be a video in and of itself. However, many of the past attractions once offered at the park don't necessarily reflect the point of this video, which is to highlight how well themed everything is. For example, Silvermine was a Western themed dark ride that opened in 1984 and closed in 2014. While certainly interesting, Phantasialand's older dark rides seem to be rather weak, emulating many elements from other popular dark rides in the United States, but kind of missing the mark themselves. For example, Silvermine seemed to borrow heavily from the Calico Mine ride at Knott's Berry Farm, mixing it with a number of elements from Disneyland's Pirates of the Caribbean. The attraction is certainly interesting and an important part of Phantasialand's history, but it's not the best that the park has to offer. In fact, judging for what excites me about the park today, I would say that Phantasialand has never been better and only seems to be improving. A look back to Phantasialand's classic dark rides may be a potential video in the future, but here I'm going to be covering the park as it currently exists in 2022. As you enter the park, you are immediately immersed in an area simply called Berlin. Working as this park's version of Main Street, the architecture and atmosphere reflect Berlin in the early 20th century, full of shops and including a decent number of attractions. You'll also notice that the park is quite beautiful, and presents its flat rides in interesting ways that fit in really well with the theming of each land. For example, I feel that the double-decker carousel is made to be much more interesting within the theming of the Berlin streets. At the end of the street is a swing ride called Wave Flight, again made just a bit more interesting by the inclusion of the surrounding theming, as well as the water features that play throughout the ride cycle. Another interesting attraction is a funhouse, with a name that roughly translates to the Crazy Hotel Tartuffe. Guests enter into the building and find themselves in an elevator that serves as a pre-show, where they encounter the hotel owner, Mr. Bockelstedt. He then welcomes the guests into his crazy and wacky hotel, which consists of a series of themed rooms that are full of tricky and disorienting funhouse elements. While funhouses are an interesting novelty of traveling carnivals, Phantasialand's decision to create an attraction like this still resonates well with me, because the surrounding environment definitely elevates it in a way I didn't think was possible. The last attraction located in Berlin is Maus au Chocolate, an interactive shooter dark ride very similar to Disney's Toy Story Mania. The premise is that you enter a cake factory that has been overrun by mice, and an exterminator named Oscar has enlisted your help to clear them out. However, the mice and the environment are not to be harmed, so you'll instead be using cake icing as your weapon to scare the mice away. As you ride through the attraction, a chocolate scent permeates the scenes as you work to scare away as many mice as possible in exchange for points. In my opinion, the gameplay for Toy Story Mania looks to be better than this because it's simply more dynamic and has more variety in the targets that you can hit. However, Mouse Out Chocolate takes the immersion of the ride further by theming the areas between the gameplay portions. I'm not personally a fan of shooter dark rides, but this still seems like a charming attraction for a Main Street area of a park. Berlin really takes the idea of a Main Street further though, not only acting as shopping and dining, but is unique in offering some smaller attractions and putting an interesting twist on them. It's a good introduction for the rest of the park, which only becomes more interesting as you walk further into it. Before you walk to the end of Berlin, there is a self-contained area that can be explored if you turn left through one of the building facades. This new area called Rookburg opened in September of 2020 and contains Vekoma's new flying coaster model, which has been aptly named Fly. It's a bit ambiguous as to whether Rookburg is considered an extension of Berlin, as it very much seems to take place there, but now with a steampunk aesthetic. Regardless, it does act as a well-themed but self-contained area that offers a lot if explored. There is detail to be found throughout, and there are a few dining establishments as well. The area also incorporates one of the park's hotels, simply called Hotel Charles Lindbergh, named after the famous American aviator. The rooms can be a bit claustrophobic, but that's also part of the theming. They also allow visitors to get a direct look into Rookburg itself, with the coaster moving past many of the rooms. The hotel also features a themed bar area called Bar 1919 that serves cocktails inspired by the steampunk theming. As for Fly itself, it appears to be simulating the idea of strapping riders to a steampunk flying machine and obviously sending them through the streets of Rookburg. Fly is the first launched flying coaster, actually featuring 2 throughout its course, and is also the longest flying coaster in the world at a length of 4,055 feet, or 1,236 kilometers. While the coaster appears to have inversions, the emphasis seems to be on how it moves through the environment and theming, which is the core of its experience. Obviously, it's a pretty cool coaster, and should definitely be on anyone's list to ride. Moving on from the front of the park, you can head to your left and into the next land, which is just simply called Fantasy. This area circles around a beautiful lake with the fantasy theming, and includes a number of themed flat rides for children. In one corner, there resides a large building with what appears to be a mini-land called Woo's Town. This section seems to represent a little fantasy town or village, with streets that wind in and out of the building, and includes a number of flat rides as well. Most notable here are the 2 indoor coasters called Winja's Fear and Winja's Force. These 2 spinning coasters, manufactured by Mauer, interweave between each other and have unique track elements. For example, both coasters will start with a vertical lift that drops them into the course, where they spin around the atrium. Halfway through though, both coasters will have a unique element. With Fear, the track will tilt forward, dropping the coaster car, and on Force, the track will flip to its side before releasing the vehicles. As one last surprise, both coasters feature a small drop track right before returning to the station. Other than these coasters though, Woo's Town is very much an area for kids. The flat rides seem to just be there to fill space, and the area offers little else other than an indoor coaster called Crazy Bats. Previously called Temple of the Nighthawk, it was renamed to Crazy Bats in 2019 and fitted with VR headsets, conveying a child-friendly story. By most accounts, the experience seems to just be okay, and the VR implementation tanks the capacity of the coaster. The other end of the fantasy section of the park seems to suffer from being underwhelming as well, because while it is well themed and beautiful, the area surrounding the lake is quite bare, with only some paddle boats and a splash battle being located in the middle. This part of the park isn't bad by any means, but its theming, or lack of it, really lies in contrast to what the rest of the park has to offer, which is far more exciting. If we move to the right of the Berlin Main Street, the first land we will encounter is called Deep in Africa. This is the smallest land of the park, offering what appears to be only a few shops and eateries, but it does pack in a lot of theming. The land is also anchored by a B&M inverted coaster called Black Mamba, which weaves in and out of the trenches that the land is built around. As Fly and now Black Mamba have illustrated, Phantasialand is limited with what it can build because of height restrictions. The way this coaster uses the terrain to instead provide a different and low-to-the-ground experience is something that will continue to define many of the park's coasters. It has a fair number of inversions, but the coaster also focuses a lot on near misses by really hugging the terrain. Deep in Africa is also connected to another of the park's hotels, simply called Hotel Matamba. As you can see, it's an extension of the Africa theming and looks out into the African section of the park. Moving on though, the next area is simply called Mexico, and definitely takes up a larger footprint of the park. Also really well themed, this area includes shops, dining, and 3 different attractions. The first of these is a Huss topspin called Talakan. Generally, I would never get on one of these because the sensation that the ride vehicle produces seems like it would be unpleasant to me, but I might make an exception because of how well themed it is. As you can see, the ride cycle is synced with music, water, and pyro effects to achieve an elevated experience with what would otherwise just be a standard flat ride. Mexico also features a mine train roller coaster manufactured by Vekoma called Colorado Adventure. By all accounts, it seems to be a fun coaster. It was actually formerly known as Colorado Adventure, the Michael Jackson thrill ride, until 2013, because Jackson opened the coaster with a ceremony in 1996. It's a weird bit of misplaced synergy, but at least the coaster's current name makes sense with the 19th century Mexican theme. While the coaster looks fine, it's also outshined thematically by the various Big Thunder Mountains that Disney has built, and I think it will continue to suffer from those comparisons. It's definitely not a large draw to the park, but still appears to be a decent experience. Mexico's signature attraction, however, is an intimate flume ride called Chiapas. Weaving in and out of the land, this highly themed attraction first takes you up a lift hill through a quarry, right through the middle of Colorado Adventure. Entering a cave, you encounter an archaeological dig site and travel through Mayan ruins. Moving down a small drop, you find yourself back outside in a small but dramatic opening surrounded by waterfalls. As you enter another cave and encounter more Mayan architecture, the ride vehicle stops and the track switch flips right, sending riders backwards. This portion of the ride track is quite scenic, showing more evidence of the archaeological dig while traveling past more ruins built into the jungle cliffs. As far as I can tell, there doesn't seem to necessarily be a story for Chiapas, but the backwards portion does eventually bring riders into what is often described as the disco room. It features multicolored lights synced to music, laser effects, a disco ball, and an animatronic stone idol using skulls as a drum kit. It's unclear to me what this has to do with the ride thematically, but it's definitely interesting. As the ride goes down a backwards drop, the vehicle parks again and is this time shifted to the right as it resumes forward motion to go up another lift hill. This next portion is pretty lengthy but scenic, taking riders past more of the dig site and some outside Mayan ruins. The logs then encounter another lift hill and then continue traveling through more rockwork. Finally, the last big drop approaches, bringing riders down into a pool being fed by various waterfalls, with riders now having returned to the Mexican town. Chiapas is certainly an interesting and well-themed flume ride, but I'm not sure if I completely understand it. It has some pretty interesting strengths, such as the novelty track switches or the strong sense of atmosphere, but I'm unsure if I'm missing some sort of narrative, especially because the inclusion of the disco room seems like a random element. Regardless though, Chiapas is certainly on my list of attractions I would like to experience. The second to last area of the park brings guests into a Chinese village with gardens, simply called Chinatown. A small but scenic area, it of course includes the themed shops and dining that you would expect elsewhere throughout the park. This area also includes Phantasialand's third hotel, simply called Hotel Ling Bao. Like the other two, it is also heavily themed and looks out into the land that it's attached to. Chinatown offers two attractions to visitors, starting with Fangju Palace. Guests first travel into the building and watch a pre-show before boarding the ride. I had trouble understanding what was being conveyed here, and apparently the internet has agreed that the issue goes beyond just a language barrier. However, from what I was able to find, the premise boils down to an underworld king who kidnaps a beautiful woman, intending to marry her. A prince comes to battle the king, using the elements of earth, wind, fire, and water as his weapons. The pre-show depicts the first battle where he loses, and guests then board this madhouse-style attraction. Once the ride cycle starts, it simulates the second battle with the environment moving around the guests. By most accounts that I can find, Fangju Palace seems to be a miss for the park, especially since the ride portion seems rather basic and lacks interesting effects. Speaking of misses, Chinatown also includes an older dark ride for the park, called Geister Rickshaw, which opened in 1981. Exploring the underworld and spirits of Chinese mythology, there are definitely some interesting ideas being portrayed here. However, the attraction also leans a little too heavily into emulating certain elements and scenes of Disney's Haunted Mansion, to its own detriment, I think. The content and premise of the attraction is inherently interesting, but I think where it really fails is in its execution, with most scenes feeling a bit unimaginative. I'm not going to go into the content of this particular attraction because it could probably fit into another video, along with attractions like Silvermine, exploring Phantasialand's dark ride phase through the 80s and 90s. I'm sure people would disagree with my assessment, especially native Germans who potentially grew up loving this attraction, but it's definitely a personal miss for me. The last area of the park is simply called Mystery, taking on a Nordic medieval theme. Entering this area from Chinatown, one of the first attractions you'll encounter is River Quest, a rapids ride manufactured by Hefena. The attraction includes elevator lifts, which have lost a bit of their novelty as they've continued to become more common on these types of rides, but are still a welcome addition. The ride track is also well themed, being intertwined with and running through the medieval streets. Adjacent to River Quest, though, is the park's completely enclosed drop tower, simply called Mystery Castle. Walking through the queue, guests will encounter a gothic horror theme, and the park will oftentimes decide to station scare actors in there as well. The premise behind the attraction is that the owner of the castle made a deal with the devil, cursing subsequent generations of the family, with all of his sons dying by the age of 30. One of his youngest manages to break the curse, but in revenge, the evil spirits took the castle for themselves. In order to rid the castle of such evil, he creates a device to extract the positive energy of visitors, hoping to drive out the spirits. The ride portion was manufactured by Intamin. It works as the device being used to harness the energy of the guests. Riders are first launched, held at the top, and then go through a sequence of drops and launches, while a few effects and audio cues play throughout the ride cycle. It's pretty straightforward, but is a fun twist on the drop tower concept, and I appreciate the theming and story. As Ruckburg is an extension of Berlin, but still its own separate area, so too is Klugheim an extension of mystery. Arguably the main draw of the park, this area is defined by the medieval Nordic style built on top of basalt mountains with two roller coasters intertwined throughout. The first of these is Rake, a family-style boomerang coaster manufactured by Vekoma. Despite the family audience, Rake is reported to still be an exciting experience, not just for the theming, but also because it provides decent forces and airtime. The coaster starts with a backwards lift hill, then dropping riders into the station through the ride course. Weaving in and out of the terrain, the coaster climbs another lift hill before dropping backwards, completing the course in reverse before returning to the station. The main draw of the area, though, will be Terran, an Intamin multi-launch steel coaster. Coming out of the station, Terran first parks riders on the launch, before suddenly accelerating them to 80 km or 50 miles an hour. As the train runs through the ride course, you'll notice that the track has no inversions, opting instead to focus on close calls by hugging the terrain and providing a lot of airtime for the riders. Eventually, the train will reach the second launch, sending riders up to 117 kilometers or 72 miles per hour in the second half. Being confined to such a small space, the track crosses itself 116 times and manages to be an ambitious experience despite the height and space limitations of the park. While Fly is a great new addition for the park, Klugheim and Terran were what put it on the radar for a lot of international tourists, and has definitely put the park on my list for top places I want to visit. It appears that Phantasialand is still in a major phase of transformation though, working to appeal to a larger crowd outside of Germany. By removing many of its historic dark rides in favor of newer but still quality experiences with top-tier theming, the park has managed to capture the attention of more and more people. I've obviously decided to cover Phantasialand because it's a great park, and its attractions and theming interest me. There's a lot of things that I really like about it, but there are also other aspects that really fall short. So, let's break down what the park does and doesn't do well. First, I'd like to talk about the flat rides. Whereas in most amusement parks, flat rides are generally just placed around to fill up space and increase park capacity a bit, Phantasialand manages to use them in interesting ways. For example, Mystery Castle works by taking the drop tower concept and enhancing it with heavy theming. While it still doesn't measure up to the greatness of Disney's Tower of Terror and its various iterations, Mystery Castle still manages to stand out with its theming, scare actors, and unique ride system. Talocan is also another excellent example of how to elevate a flat ride with theming and special effects. Even Waveflight, with its water effects and sitting in the context of the heavily themed Berlin Main Street, manages to stand out. However, on the flip side, I do feel the park relies far too heavily on flat rides in other areas though. For example, Fangju Palace suffers from poor storytelling and a generally underwhelming ride experience. The fantasy section of the park, while often well themed and beautiful, manages to also rely a little too heavily on flat rides as well. I understand that the target demographic is small children, but this is an area I would like to see the park address more creatively with more family-oriented dark rides. So, the lesson here? Well, flat rides can be great additions to a theme park, but they really have to go beyond their capacity and thrill factors. By really committing to the theming, or treating them as kinetic draws to certain areas, Phantasialand stands as a great example of how to execute flat rides well. Another aspect I would like to speak about is theming. The really well detailed areas are fantastic, especially in conjunction with the kinetic nature of the large attractions that exist within them. There's just something really cool about seeing Black Mamba roar through an African village. However, as you may have noticed, many areas of the park transition and blend poorly between the various lands. For example, this pathway allows you to see Mexico on your right, but with the lift hill and African theming of Black Mamba quite apparent in the distance. On the left side of the pathway, you can see Terran gliding around Klugheim. Obviously, the park is incredibly small, but these various lands didn't seem to be designed to be juxtaposed with one another. If it's something like Epcot's World Showcase, or the Central Lagoon of Islands of Adventure, the juxtaposition is done purposefully and effectively. However, it's clear here that it's an issue of space, but I still see potential easy fixes that the park chose to not go for. As an example, shielding the lift hill of Black Mamba with more rockwork doesn't seem out of the question. A huge strength of this park is how immersive and beautiful the lands can be when you stand in certain areas, but that immersion is easily broken when you can see the clunky transitions between the lands. One last major aspect I would like to address is the storytelling. I've already commented on how Fangju Palace suffers from a muddled and poorly conveyed story, but this goes beyond just that. For example, while Terran and Fly may be excellent coasters surrounded by incredible theming, they do lack a narrative as far as I can determine. Extra context, even at a surface level, would elevate them even further. This is especially apparent with Chiapas, which doesn't really seem to make sense to me despite enjoying it for what it is. Why is there a disco scene inside a Mayan temple? Perhaps we'll never know. With that being said, additions like Mystery Castle and Masal Chocolate do seem to have a clear premise, so I do give the park credit there. In general, most of the criticisms I have with the park are a bit nitpicky, which should serve as a testament to its strengths. When the theme park narrative is often dominated by Disney and Universal, it's easy for smaller but still really well developed parks to be overshadowed. People love to talk about Splash Mountain, but what about the attraction that inspired it, the Timber Mountain Log Ride at Knott's Berry Farm? Why has such a strange but enchanting attraction like Arthur the Ride at Europa Park flown under a lot of people's radar? This is why I previously covered Efteling, because I was just fascinated by how dedicated that park was to quality attractions and atmosphere. Disney and Universal offer quite a lot, but parks like Phantasialand are emerging as worthy destinations that focus a lot more on original and creative ideas. Speaking from the perspective as a theme park fan from the United States, parks like this are often overshadowed by the corporate-driven IP synergy of Orlando and California, and so I've decided to expand the scope of the channel to include more overviews of parks like this. That's not to say that I still won't focus on Disney and Universal, but we're also missing a lot of exposure to other fantastic experiences that I would like to highlight occasionally. With all of this being said, if you enjoy the types of videos that I produce and want to help the channel out, I strongly recommend hitting the like button on the video. If you haven't already, I also encourage you to hit the subscribe button with bell icon so as to be notified when new videos are released.